Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Saturday, April 12th, 2025.
Hello.
We're going to be digging into a pretty significant event that happened just yesterday in South Carolina.
The execution of Mikal Mahdi.
Exactly. And we've got quite a bit of information pulled together for this. Legal reviews, news reports, Wikipedia for background, plus insights from the ACLU and the Death Penalty Information Center.
Yeah, quite a range.
Our goal here isn't just to list facts, but to really unpack this. Understand the why behind the what, the legal side, the personal side, all the complexities, without just drowning everyone in data.
Right, because this case, it really opens up these larger discussions about capital punishment, particularly in South Carolina right now.
Definitely. It touches on justice, mitigating factors, potential systemic issues, maybe?
Absolutely. All of that.
Okay, so let's start with Mikal Mahdi himself. Born March 20, 1983. He was 42 when he was executed yesterday, April 11th.
And the core reason for his death sentence was his conviction for a series of murders back in July 2004, spanning 3 states.
Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Let's break those down.
Okay. So in Virginia, there was Greg Jones. Mahdi allegedly stabbed him after a drug deal went bad, but he was never actually tried for that specific one.
Why not?
Because of the other convictions that came later. They sort of superseded it.
Got it. Then North Carolina.
That was Christopher Jason Boggs. He was 29, a convenience store clerk. Mahdi shot and killed him during a robbery.
It's just tragic. And South Carolina.
James Edward Myers, a 56-year-old off-duty police officer, shot 9 times, and horrifically, his body was then burned with diesel fuel.
That's incredibly brutal. And the sources mentioned this was part of a larger crime spree, carjackings, robberies.
Yes, it seems it was a violent period. It all culminated in his arrest on July 21st, 2004, down in Florida.
And he was caught driving Officer Myers' truck.
That's right, driving the victim's vehicle.
So after the arrest, the legal wheels start turning.
They do, and in different states. So South Carolina handed down the death sentence in 2006 for Officer Myers' murder. But then, later, in 2011, he was actually extradited to North Carolina. And there, he received a sentence of life without parole for the murder of Christopher Boggs.
So even without the death sentence, he was facing life behind bars.
Correct. Life without the possibility of parole. That was already secured.
But the South Carolina death sentence, that wasn't the end of the legal road, was it? There were appeals.
Oh, absolutely. Extensive appeals. Went through the state courts, then the federal courts.
All rejected.
Every single one, ultimately.
Yeah.
Including the U.S. Supreme Court. They declined to take up the case back in 2017, basically saying they found no major constitutional flaws.
And there was another legal challenge more recently, right? About the execution methods themselves.
Yes, in 2023. He was part of a lawsuit challenging South Carolina's use of the firing squad and the electric chair. The argument was that they constitute cruel and unusual punishment.
How did that turn out?
The South Carolina Supreme Court dismissed that lawsuit in July 2024. They upheld both methods as constitutional within the state.
Which, unfortunately for Mahdi, paved the way for the execution. The death warrant was signed March 14th this year, setting the date for yesterday, April 11th.
And then came this quite unusual point. He was given a choice of execution method.
Lethal injection, electrocution, or firing squad.
And he chose the firing squad.
Which is pretty rare, isn't it? Only the second person in South Carolina since they brought it back as an option.
Exactly. Since they resumed executions in 2024, he's only the second to choose it. Richard Moore was the first.
Why did he choose that? Did the sources give any insight?
Yes. His lawyers indicated it stemmed from fear of the other methods. He reportedly feared being, and this is a direct quote, burned and mutilated in the electric chair.
Understandable fear.
And he also apparently had concerns about lethal injection, perhaps about it being prolonged or botched, which has happened in other states.
So the firing squad was seen as the, quote, lesser of 3 evils.
That's the phrase used, yeah. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? When being shot by multiple officers is considered the preferable way to die compared to the state's other options.
It really does. So the execution happened at 6:01 p.m. yesterday. Broad River Correctional Institution.
3 correctional officers firing simultaneously with rifles. Standard procedure for a firing squad to ensure anonymity.
And he was pronounced dead just minutes later.
4 minutes later at 6:05 p.m.
We also know about his last meal request. Sounds like quite a spread.
Yeah, ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea.
Did he make any final statement?
No. Reports indicate he declined to make a final statement.
Okay, let's pull back a bit and look at the wider context here in South Carolina. Capital punishment. It had been on hold for a while.
It had. For 13 years, actually. From 2011 until September 2024, there was a de facto moratorium.
Primarily because they couldn't get the drugs for lethal injection right.
That was the main reason cited. Pharmaceutical companies became unwilling to supply them for executions.
So since September 2024, they've resumed. And Mahdi is the 5th person executed since then.
That's right, 5th person in about 7 months, and the second, my firing squad. It suggests a pretty aggressive resumption of capital punishment in this state.
And another striking fact from our sources, no governor in South Carolina has granted clemency in a death penalty case in the modern era, like the last 50 years or so.
None. That's a significant data point about the political and legal climate there regarding capital punishment.
So for our listeners, it's important to understand you can't just get the death penalty for any murder in South Carolina.
No, absolutely not. It has to be murder plus specific, legally defined, aggravating circumstances.
We found there are 12 categories.
Correct. Things like murder committed during another violent felony kidnapping, criminal sexual conduct, robbery, burglary, murder for hire, killing a police officer, like in Myers' case, or a prosecutor, judge, killing more than one person, killing a child, things of that nature.
So very specific, heinous factors need to be proven.
Exactly. And historically, the states used various methods. Hanging way back, then electrocution was primary for a long time. Lethal injection came in. They even had a gas chamber briefly. And now, firing squad is back on the table alongside electrocution and, theoretically, lethal injection if they could get the drugs.
Now, this is where the story gets even more complex. Mahdi's background. The sources describe a really, really difficult childhood.
Yeah, chaotic is the word used. Marked by significant abuse and neglect.
He witnessed his father being violent towards his mother.
Yes, and his mother fled the home when he was just 4 years old.
Leaving him with the father.
Leaving him with the father, who then reportedly turned the abuse onto Mikal from that young age.
That's horrifying, and it led to severe mental health issues very early on.
It seems so. Sources say he was suicidal by age 8. At age 9, he was involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility.
Involuntarily committed at 9 years old.
9 years old. It paints a picture of profound early trauma.
And the difficulties continued. Homeschooled by this same father, who apparently had some conspiracy theory beliefs.
Right. And perhaps one of the most shocking details is the amount of time he spent in solitary confinement, starting as a juvenile.
How much time are we talking?
The estimate cited is around 8,000 hours between the ages of 14 and 21.
8,000 hours in solitary as a teenager and young adult.
Yes. It's an almost unimaginable amount of isolation, especially during formative years. And on top of that, he had a diagnosis of major depressive disorder.
So this extensive history of trauma, abuse, mental health struggles, this became a factor in his legal appeals, didn't it?
It absolutely did. His defense argued that his original trial lawyers failed significantly in this area.
Failed how?
They argued the lawyers didn't properly investigate or present this crucial mitigating evidence about his traumatic childhood to the jury during the sentencing phase.
Evidence that might have persuaded a jury to choose life without parole instead of death.
That was the argument. That this context was vital for understanding him as a person and for making a life or death sentencing decision. It's reported that the judge at his sentencing heard less than 30 minutes of testimony about his upbringing.
Less than 30 minutes to cover all of that.
That's what's reported. It raises serious questions about whether the sentencing body truly had the full picture.
The ACLU weighed in quite strongly on this point.
They did. They framed Mahdi's case as a failure of the system to protect a survivor of childhood trauma. Their perspective is that the system failed him repeatedly, from childhood through to his execution, and that his trauma wasn't adequately considered.
His defense attorney used strong words, too, calling the execution barbaric and a horrifying act, again pointing to that systemic neglect.
Yes, very strong condemnation, focusing on the failure to address the underlying issues from his past.
Of course, there's another crucial perspective. The victim's family, James Myers' family.
Understandably, their focus was different. Reports indicate they expressed hope that the execution might bring some measure of closure, allowing them to move past the violence and focus on remembering him.
Which is a completely valid and important perspective in these discussions.
Absolutely. The pain of victims' families is immense and needs to be acknowledged.
Okay, stepping back again, let's look at some broader points about the death penalty itself, drawing from the Death Penalty Information Center, the DPIC.
Right. They provide a lot of data. First, context. South Carolina is one of 27 states, as of just a few days ago, that still authorizes the death penalty.
And nationally, since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated, lethal injection has been the main method. But others like electrocution, gas, firing squad are still used or available in some places.
Now, some key arguments the DPIC highlights against the death penalty. One is deterrence. Is there proof it actually deters crime?
And the conclusion is,
most studies find no convincing evidence of a deterrent effect. In fact, the National Research Council reviewed the research and said studies claiming a deterrent effect are fundamentally flawed.
okay, what about cost? People sometimes think it's cheaper to execute someone than keep them in prison for life.
That's a common misconception. But the reality, according to DPIC data and numerous studies, is the opposite. Capital cases, the trials, the mandatory appeals are significantly more expensive than non-capital cases, even ones resulting in life without parole.
Much more expensive.
Considerably so. Then there's the issue of executing vulnerable individuals, people with serious mental illness or intellectual disabilities, or those who were juveniles when the crime occurred. While there are legal restrictions now, like the Supreme Court banning the execution of those who were under 18 at the time of the crime, concerns remain about applying it to people with diminished capacity.
And racial disparities, that's a big one.
A huge one. The DPIC data is stark. Over 75% of murder victims in cases resulting in an execution were white.
Even though nationally, only about half of all murder victims are white.
Exactly. So the race of the victims seems to play a significant role in who gets sentenced to death. Numerous studies suggest racial bias, conscious or unconscious, infects the process, particularly showing that defendants are much more likely to get the death penalty if the victim was white compared to if the victim was black.
So the application doesn't seem to be colorblind based on that data.
The data strongly suggests not, and public opinion seems to be shifting somewhat too.
What did that Gallup poll find?
A 2019 poll found that for the first time, a majority of Americans, 60%, said they preferred a punishment other than the death penalty for murder.
With life without parole being the most cited alternative.
Yes. Support for the death penalty itself has declined from its peak, though it still has considerable support, but the preference for alternatives is notable.
And finally, perhaps the most chilling aspect, the risk of executing an innocent person.
It's not just a theoretical risk. The DPIC tracks exonerations people sentenced to death who were later found innocent and released.
How many?
Since 1973, there have been nearly 200 such exonerations. On average, about 4 wrongly convicted death row prisoners exonerated each year.
4 per year. That's sobering.
It really is. It underscores the fallibility of the justice system and the irreversible nature of the death penalty.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive into Mikal Mahdi's execution really highlights this tangled web, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have profound personal tragedy, his history.
Yeah, the abuse, the neglect, the mental health issues, the questions about the legal representation he received.
Then you have the very clear legal process, the seriousness of his crimes, the state's decision to actively pursue executions again after the moratorium.
And the choice of the firing squad adds another layer of, starkness to it all.
And it forces us, and hopefully you listening, to think about these really tough questions. How do we balance justice for victims, which is paramount,
with considering mitigating factors like extreme childhood trauma? How do we account for potential systemic failures?
What do the different execution methods say about us? And fundamentally, what does a case like this tell us about the values embedded in our justice system?
These aren't easy questions. There are no simple answers here.
No, definitely not. We really encourage you, if this has sparked your interest or concern, to maybe look into some of the sources we mentioned. The ACLU, the Death Penalty Information Center, they offer a lot more detail.
Yeah, explore the different facets of capital punishment in South Carolina and more broadly. It's a debate with deep historical roots and very current life and death consequences.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.